Okay, thank you for your interest in inclusionary housing. I'm Jason Krugerberg. I'm the Development Services Director with the City of Arcadia, and we thought it would be helpful to go through a voice recording of this PowerPoint presentation because this is a complex issue and regulation. So we felt a kind of a guided description through the PowerPoint would be good. There are 18 slides that we'll go through here in addition, and please check our website for additional information. There's a Q&A on there. There's the draft inclusionary housing ordinance itself and other information that's pertinent to housing that might be useful for you to look at as well. So again, thank you for your interest, and we will go through this presentation. And again, there's a time or place for submitting comments and such on our website. We'll talk about that towards the end. So on to the next slide. Very simple question. What is it? What is inclusionary housing? An inclusionary housing ordinance is something that is adopted by a city that requires that residential developments include some affordable housing units as part of their development. The key objective of the ordinance is to expand affordable housing stock within a community, and that requires the development of units to be provided to lower and moderate income households. So typically these types of units, these affordable units, are not built by the development community unless there are either incentives involved or there are requirements to do so. The state of California has created a lot of incentives for these types of developments to be used, things like density bonuses, etc., but it's typically left up to cities to create the requirement side of it. So many cities in LA County have been working on these ordinances, and they are probably the most popular method of obtaining affordable units in your city. So what are these units like? The table on this slide shows Los Angeles County's income limits to qualify for affordable housing. And so this table is a little complicated, but what you'll see along the top are numbers 1 through 8. That is actually household size, so the number of people in the household. And along the left-hand side, left-hand column, are the different levels of affordability. So from extremely low up through moderate, and you'll see a lot of numbers in this table. So based on the size of a household, there are different qualification numbers for how much income that household can make to qualify for an affordable unit. So as you can see from the numbers, this is not homeless housing, this is not tiny homes, this is not special needs housing. The occupants of these units must show that their household meets these figures to be able to qualify for a unit. So it is a very specific requirement. It pertains all over Los Angeles County. It's not just relevant to Arcadia. It's the same numbers that are used throughout the county. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. This slide is answering the question of why an ordinance is needed. The last slide show how people can qualify, and this begins to talk about why an ordinance is needed in the first place. So the state of California assigns responsibility for affordable housing units to each city in the state, and this slide shows Arcadia's allocation of those units. So as you can see from the image here, this is called the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, or the RHNA, R-H-N-A. And the RHNA for Arcadia, as you can see, is 3,214 units, and that's a big number. It's broken down by different income categories, as you can see from the slide here, from very low to above moderate income. The above moderate income row there is just units that are created by the marketplace. Those are just market rate units that are created on any project. The remaining units are all at these various affordable levels. And so that is what the city is required to provide capacity for. And that's an important point, because this doesn't mean that this number of units must be built. It just means that each city, in Arcadia in our case, 3,214 units, needs to provide the capacity for those units to be provided. And so what does that mean? That means that the city needs to create zoning and create the possibility for these units to be built in certain areas of the city where they are most appropriate. So in our case, in Arcadia's case, the city adopted its housing element in 2022, and the housing element is a group of requirements for provision of housing of all kinds within the city. and then adopted rezoning efforts in 2024. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but we adopted rezoning efforts that provided that capacity that I mentioned to be able to create these units. So that is our state quote-unquote requirement to provide that capacity, and that's the number of units that we are looking to provide. This slide talks about, again, it's a continuation of why an ordinance is needed. So we talked about on the last slide about the state requirements. This slide talks about what are the real reasons why an ordinance is necessary. And so as the slide shows, there are really four main groups of reasons why the ordinance is necessary to be able to create the capacity for the units mentioned on the last slide. The first one is funding limitations. Pretty straightforward. The city, like most cities in the state, doesn't have a specific dedicated funding source to provide affordable housing. We don't have the ability to simply use city money to subsidize these units to be able to get them to these levels of affordability that we've talked about. That's a clear one. The second one is that the city doesn't have, there's a lack of city-owned land and public housing. So some cities own a great deal of property. They may make a choice politically or otherwise to use that public property for affordable housing units. Cities have done that. The city of Arcadia doesn't have that land, doesn't have vacant land or leftover land that could be used for this purpose. So we need to find other ways to be able to provide this housing need. The third item is, and why ordinances are a helpful way to go about this process, is that an inclusionary housing ordinance enables affordable units to be integrated into larger developments to appear as coordinated, cohesive projects. And this is important because these units are parts of larger projects. They look the same, they have the same materials, they feel the same as market rate units. And that we feel, and many cities feel, many jurisdictions feel, is the best way to provide these units. Otherwise, you're potentially providing projects that are 100% affordable projects or other specialty housing projects. Not that that is a negative thing, but integrating the units is, we feel, the best way to do it. And that gets to the last point, is we feel that that's the most bang for the buck. And what we mean when we say that is, if we have an ordinance that requires a certain percentage of units to be affordable, a large project comes in that might be taking advantage of state requirements for bonuses for density or any other housing incentives, and having an ordinance in place allows more units to be built than could be built otherwise in the absence of an ordinance. Now that we've described a lot of the whys on this process, we'll go through a little bit of background, just a little bit of history, and I alluded to some of these numbers earlier. And as we mentioned, the housing element was adopted by the city in 2022. And what the housing element is basically the city's blueprint for providing housing throughout the city. And that includes all of the policies for the types of housing to be created, where multifamily housing should be, where single-family housing should be, how to deal with affordable housing, et cetera, et cetera. So that is basically your blueprint for how housing is going to work. And the city, for many, many years, for decades, has had a policy that we will protect our single-family neighborhoods from additional density to the extent we can, and we will allow for dense housing, for multifamily housing in areas that can support it. And so that is what our housing element does. Once we submitted our housing element, again, part of that reason for that was to create that capacity for those 3,000 plus units we talked about earlier. The state would not initially approve our element until we did some of these rezoning efforts that we had said we would do to allow that capacity. So we went through a process of needing to do those rezoning efforts. So as you can see on the timeline on the slide here, February 15th of 2022, the City Council approved the element. That is an element that is an 8-year planning horizon of 2021 through 29. On February 6th of 2024, the city approved those rezonings that the state required us to do to show that the element could be implemented. And very shortly thereafter, on February 9th, the State Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD, they certified our housing element. So they approved it at that time. So since that time and now all the way up through 2029, we'll be in what we call implementation mode. So that's all the follow-up actions that we have said we will do to create housing in Arcadia. And the inclusionary housing ordinance is a big part of that. And so, as you can see from the bottom part, the housing element creates all sorts of implementation actions, and inclusionary housing, again, a big piece of that. In terms of implementation, affordable units are being proposed without an inclusionary ordinance. I think it's important to mention that the table here that's shown on this slide shows 4 existing projects that, without us even having an ordinance, have proposed affordable housing units to be implemented and integrated into those projects. And so we can go through this table very quickly, but essentially, one of these projects is under construction. That's the Alexan Azalea project, the 34 East Santa Clara Street project, which has 26 affordable units. One of the projects is already approved, but not yet under construction. That's the second one, the Derby project. And then 2 other projects, the bottom projects, are in various stages of the review process and have proposed affordable units as part of those projects. They've proposed those units because they get various incentives from the state, and they will be able to get density bonuses for their projects, et cetera. So these projects will keep happening, but they won't happen in the amount or the intensity that we think is important. So that is why we do believe that an ordinance is necessary to not rely on the private development community to do it, but to require them to. And so these are the kinds of numbers that we would be looking at, essentially, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But wanted to make sure that folks understood that these projects are already being built, and these units are already being integrated into them. And it's also important, I think, to know or to recognize that there have been other affordable housing projects built in the city over time. And I don't need to go into that in great detail, but there's a senior affordable housing project on Las Tunas called Heritage Park, which is 50 plus units. There's another senior affordable project that was built on Campus Drive called Campus Commons, which is 50 plus units, and we have several others in town. So these projects exist, but the ordinance does create a method of providing more units to be built. Now, what does an ordinance actually look like? Mentioned earlier, there's a lot of cities within the Los Angeles County who have these ordinances. We think there's, right now, at current count, there's 21 cities in the county that have these ordinances. And there's several others who, like Arcadia, are currently working on adopting an ordinance. So what this slide is showing is just a general summary of what some other Los Angeles County inclusionary housing ordinances look like. They typically have a trigger from 3 to 10 units. So what that means is when a project comes in, if it's between 3 or 10 units, the inclusionary housing ordinance applies to it. And any project bigger than that, whatever that initial threshold is, it also provides a percentage of affordable units that are required. Typically, that's between 15 and 20%, depending on the ordinance and the city. And then there's an affordability period, which ranges from 45 years into perpetuity, and that is really a reflection of state law. So in a second, we'll talk about what the City of Arcadia's draft ordinance looks like, but just for purposes of summarizing, that's kind of what typically these ordinances look like. And on the right-hand side of the slide, there are some cities that already have inclusionary housing ordinance, and some of our neighbors, Pasadena, South Pasadena, Alhambra, Monterey Park, LA County, and Burbank are examples of cities within our region or area that do also have an inclusionary housing ordinance in place. What are the key components of Arcadia's draft ordinance? And so keep in mind that the key word here is draft. This is just proposed at this time. Any of these items can change, but this is what we believe will be the most effective ordinance for our city. And these components we think will be the most important pieces of the ordinance. So, generally most cities' ordinances look very similar. They all do have some local nuance based on economic conditions or land values or political choices, but really these ordinances look pretty similar across the board. So The key component that we're looking at for Arcadia's ordinance is that we believe it should be applicable to projects with 10 or more units. So that would mean that if a project came in that was smaller than that, smaller than 10 units, this would not apply to it. That would just be a market-based project that would be at whatever affordability level the developer wanted to pursue. But for projects of 10 units or more, the ordinance would apply to them. It would apply to both ownership and rental projects. So condominiums in terms of like an ownership project, or apartment buildings would be an example of a rental project. We would apply this ordinance to both. There would be options for affordability depending on the level of affordability. We talked about those different ranges within the county for very low, low, moderate, extremely low, these different levels that the county sets for numbers. We would have different affordability requirements based on those levels. We'd also provide compliance options and incentives. That's actually a state requirement that we'll talk about in a minute, that there have to be options to these ordinances. You can't just require the units to be provided. You have to provide options to the development community as well. So we'll chat about that. And then the project the ordinance would supply a affordable housing trust fund. So we would create this fund to be able to collect fees that the city could ultimately use over time to be used towards affordable projects that we could subsidize or sponsor or co-produce, essentially. So that is a kind of a longer term goal here, and we'll talk about how that is going to work in a second. So the next slide here is really the key piece of the ordinance, and that is, what are the right numbers for Arcadia? We really want to make sure that we're coming up with an ordinance that addresses our economic reality. That's a real snapshot of what the land values are within the city of Arcadia, and what the economic picture is. And we don't just want to pick a number from it that another city may use or that the state may want us to pick, because we want it to be grounded in economic reality. And the ordinance needs to be actually implementable and achievable. It shouldn't have a cooling effect on development. So you got to find that sweet spot. That is difficult to do. So what the city did is contracted with an economic firm called Kaiser Marston and Associates, and they're one of the more preeminent land value firms in the region. They did a financial analysis for us that looks at this issue. And so, as the slide says, what are the right numbers for Arcadia? The percentage of affordable units required for both rental and ownership projects. That is the number that Kaiser Marston looked into for us, and then also looked into different options for compliance that include not providing the units, such as providing an in lieu fee rather than providing a unit, or providing units off-site, and we'll talk about each of those things. But again, wanted to make sure that the work that we're doing here is economically feasible. So this next slide just tells you a little bit about the work that Kaiser Marston did, the financial evaluation that they went through to figure out these numbers for us. And as you can see from the slide, what they did was look at prototype projects in various zones of the city to be evaluated for the reality of being able to build these units. And they're looking at variables like the size of the property, the density that the city allows, height, parking, land values, all of the development standards that exist in different parts of the city. And I think that's important, is that not every part of the city is the same. Not every density is obviously the same. A project in the downtown may be much more intense than a project, along a commercial corridor somewhere else in the city. So Kaiser Marston developed proformas for each of these types of development types, and went through that to be able to create realistic scenarios of what could actually be built out there in the city. So as the next slide here shows, these proformas were all analyzed based on similar criteria, and in these different areas throughout the city, the economic consultants looked at the land value supported by what would be considered 100% market rate project. What would come in right now if we had no additional regulation, and how many units could that support, and what type of profit margin would we be looking at? Then they added on the magnitude of the enhanced value that the city created by our recent rezonings. We mentioned that we had to do these rezoning procedures to meet our housing element. Earlier in this presentation, we talked about that. They wanted to make sure that they captured whatever additional value we added through those rezoning efforts to create more density in those areas. And then where the rubber hits the road is, what is the value enhancement that can reasonably be committed to the provision of inclusionary units within a market rate development? And that's a lot of large words, but what that basically means is what profit margin still exists after the developer is required to subsidize these units to be affordable in the guise of the entire project. And so that really is the important piece, and that's where you get to what numbers are supportable within an inclusionary housing ordinance. Again, as mentioned earlier, you don't want to come in with a number like, well, we're going to require 20% of the units to be affordable if the economics just don't bear that out. If that's not real, that's going to mean nothing gets developed. So we need to be careful about how we do that and find, again, that balance point for where the regulation meets the economic reality. So the next slide will show what our proposal is. And again, this is a draft. But this is based on our economic analysis and based on what our consultants feel is supportable numbers. And as you'll see in the table here, this table is for rental units, so this would be for apartment type buildings, and it shows the percentage of affordable units that would be required at each of these various levels of affordability. So again, those are all terms of art based on how they qualify from an income standpoint, from very low to moderate. And so this table shows that if a project came in and was going to suggest providing units for very low income households, 9% of the units would need to be provided for those households. If it was a mixture of very low or low units, that would be 11%. And then on up 14% for projects that will be rented to low-income households, and 18% of the project's units if they were to be rented to moderate households. So again, this is a sliding scale based on the economic realities of subsidizing units at these various levels. So that is what we are working with at the moment, and this information is on our website within the draft ordinance, which again we'll talk about before the presentation ends here. So the next slide shows the proposed affordable unit requirements for ownership units. So these are for condominium projects or these types of projects which are not rentals. This is much more challenging. The numbers, the economic numbers don't support a large number of units being able to be provided through the condominium type projects or ownership projects. 5% of all required affordable units shall be sold to moderate income households. That is our current recommendation. So for these types of projects, the alternatives may be more popular or may be more prevalent, which is what we'll talk about in the next slide, but that's the last line on this particular slide, which is the focus will be on in lieu fees for ownership projects. And again, what that means is that if the project proponent doesn't want to provide these units, they could pay a fee in lieu of providing the units, and then that fee would be used to provide affordable units in other areas. And so that is really the focus of the next couple of slides. So we'll move to the next one, which is a quick description of what those alternatives are. This is, again, a state law. Requires that if you're going to have an inclusionary housing ordinance, it needs to have options. You can't just have an ordinance that simply requires the units to be built. You need to have options for the development community, and they need to be available for any project, but you can set them at different levels. So the two options that Arcadia has put in our ordinance are, one is off-site construction, meaning if you're required to provide, let's just say 10% of your units or 9% of your units, that number of units could also be built elsewhere in the city as part of the development of your project. You'd be required to build them somewhere. The other option is an in lieu fee, which is where you literally pay a established fee in lieu of the provision of the unit, and that fee goes to the city's housing trust fund, which then can be used to put units in somewhere where they may be more appropriate or easier to provide, etc. So the offsite construction option we don't believe will be used very often, just because it's a unique and challenging one given land values and given the fact that often property owners don't own a number of properties in the city to be able to mix and match units like that. But it is an option and it could be done. In lieu fees are a much more common and prevalent possibility, and so the next slide we'll talk a bit about that. So this slide just goes along to say how this would work and how in lieu fees work. And again, the options for paying these fees in lieu of providing the units. In the draft ordinance, we would include the process and the requirements, but the actual fee would be created through a separate process, through a modification to the city's fee schedule to determine the appropriate fee, and we've currently initiated that study to determine what that fee would look like, and it may differ for ownership units versus rental units, but we're working on that right now. The slide here talks about what the ordinance would say, and so what we feel is fair and applicable is that in lieu fees would be an option for all ownership projects, 10 units or over. For rental projects, in lieu fees would be an option for smaller projects between 10 and 20 units. So in those cases, a 10 to 20 unit project, which quite frankly is the majority of the city's projects that come through, a developer would have the option to either provide the units required or to pay the in lieu fee. For larger projects, for over 20 units, the way the ordinance is drafted now is the affordable units need to be provided. So that is how it is currently drafted. The other piece that we should mention is that the in lieu fee would be kind of prorated, so it would be paid for any fraction of the inclusionary unit that results from the calculation. So when you do the math based on the size of your project, we would get an in lieu fee should those fees be paid at those fractions. And then, as we've already mentioned, the collected fees would be placed in the city's Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which would be established to provide affordable housing units elsewhere. So that's how in lieu fees would work as an option and how they're currently drafted into the ordinance. So the next slide just goes through how the process will work, just kind of a quick summary of that. Once a developer is proposing an inclusionary housing ordinance, once a developer is proposing a project and the inclusionary housing ordinance kicks in, this would be how it would be implemented. The project proponent would give us, the city, an affordable housing plan. That would be submitted with the development. That would include the number of affordable units, where those are located, what their level of affordability is, etc. We would be reviewing that and approving that along with the project. The affordable units are required to be dispersed throughout the site with materials and finishes that are comparable with all the market rate units. They would look the same, they would feel the same as I mentioned earlier. Same access to any of the amenities in the project as the market rate units, and then they're required to be designated at their affordable level for a certain times that are required by state law. So 45 years for for sale units and 55 years for rental units. So this is just, again, a brief kind of summary about how the process works when a development is submitted. So final slide here just shows the next steps. We will be finalizing the inclusionary housing ordinance. There is a copy of that on the website. So if you'd like to go to that, you can go through the actual text of the ordinance and look at some of the things we've chatted about through this presentation. There will be public hearings at the Planning Commission and City Council level on this topic. We expect that to occur sometime in the first quarter of 2025, and then the implementation of the ordinance would be just basically looking at projects as they came in the door. So if you need more information, please look through our website. We have a lot of information on here. We have a Q&A that goes through some of the main questions that folks ask or are confused about with this ordinance. As we mentioned, this is a technical and kind of challenging topic, so we hope that Q&A may help in going through some of those challenging issues. We also have links on our website to our housing element, of course, to the entire text of our housing element, and a lot of additional information that may be helpful. If you have questions on the website, there's an email address where you can post questions. We will respond to those. You can make comments, however you'd like to use that or engage with us. There's a way to do that. We're happy to call you and talk through any of this stuff with you if you're interested. And there's also a place on our website where you can sign up for updates, and we can give you updates on when the ordinance may be coming forward through the hearing process and any changes to the process itself. So hopefully that helps, and we appreciate you listening. We know it's a lot and it's a complicated issue, but it's an important one for the city. So again, thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of us. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.